England is a cup of tea, France a wheel of ripened brie, Greece a short squat olive tree, America is a gun. What does stand your ground mean? A dwelling or residence in which the person has a right to be, has no duty to retreat, and has the right to stand his or her ground and use or threaten to use A. Non-deadly force against another when and to the extent that the person reasonably believes that such conduct is necessary to defend himself or herself or another against the other's imminent use of unlawful force, or B. Deadly force if he or she reasonably believes that using or threatening to use such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself or another, or to prevent the imminent commission of a forcible felony. Hi, good evening, everyone, and I want to welcome you to another edition of Tabernacle Talks. This is Dr. Michelle Pierce Mobley, and most of you call me Dr. Michelle, and I am so excited tonight to have just a powerful guest with us tonight, Dr. Terrence T. Allen. And he is a research scientist in the social sciences. And because of the topic that we're talking about tonight, I thought it was extremely important that we get someone who is well-versed in the areas of guns, policing, and just how that affects adverse communities and underserved communities. But before we get started, because I have a ton of questions for Dr. Allen, I just want to go over his bio because I think it is just so impressive. Dr. Allen's a research scientist at the Texas Juvenile Crime Prevention Center at Prairie View A&M University. So before joining the center, he was on the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin and served as the coordinator of juvenile justice concentration at North Carolina Central University, as well as on the faculty of Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. He has a combined 35 years of practice and research experience, and his general research interest and area of experience is children and families residing in urban communities. He is particularly interested in children involved in multiple systems and the interaction between police and juveniles in urban communities. Dr. Allen's work is guided by the belief that the coordination of child welfare, education, and juvenile justice systems are critical to helping children and families in the margins of society. During his career, he has served as a consultant for various social service agencies in Ohio and Michigan, including Cuyahoga County Juvenile Court, Cleveland Municipal School District, Wayne County Juvenile Court, Wayne County Mental Health Agency. The focus of his work has been to help private community-based agencies and public social service systems develop and implement a coordinated system of change that will improve the quality of their overall service delivery systems. He is a member of several professional organizations, including the Society for the Study of Social Problems, the Council of Social Work Education, Society of Social Work Research, and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, where he has also served on the National Advisory Board. His education includes a BA in History from the University of California, Los Angeles, a master's degree in Social Science Administration from Mandel School of Applied Social Science at Case Western Reserve University, and a PhD in Social Work and Criminal Justice from the University of Alabama. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Allen to the show tonight. Welcome, Dr. Allen.
Well, thank you.
I have, of course, a variety of questions, and obviously our topic tonight is, obviously Johnny has a gun, and Johnny's had a gun for a long time. And we want to talk about the Stand Your Ground legislation. My particular interest in Stand Your Ground was because it was just recently implemented in Ohio in December of 2020, and there's been a lot of discussion here. But I think that there's a lot of societal disagreement about the role of handguns and what role they play in society. So at a time when there's so much public outrage to decrease gun violence, stand your ground laws continue to be passed. Why should we be concerned about these stand your ground laws?
Okay. We should be concerned about stand your ground laws. Primarily, well, one reason is because they are disproportionately used. And when I say disproportionate, disproportionate use is with the stand your ground laws. Perhaps I should give you some background on stand your ground laws.
Certainly.
I think people they try to look at stand your ground laws in contemporary society based on some of these more recent cases, particularly the Castle domain. But stand your ground legislation was really started in the early to mid 1990s in places like Detroit and New Orleans, where there was an explosion of carjacking incidents in these urban communities. The legislation really took root in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, it was situations where if a person was threatened, they could use deadly force to protect themselves. Now, on the surface, that might sound reasonable. If a person is being in harm's way, then they should be able to use deadly force to protect themselves. However, many of the victims were white women, and almost all of the perpetrators were young Black men. So that really was the catalyst behind the stand your ground legislation. And I think New Orleans may have been the very first one. The law gave people, but specifically women, gave them a free pass to kill, and even with no evidence to support the intent to hurt or harm someone. In other words, they were able to, and I use an example just to put it into context. In New Orleans, at this time when there was, again, this explosion of carjacking incidents, where many of the victims were, most of the victims were carjacking, or stand your ground, in this case, carjacking laws. Most of the victims were African Americans, and most of the perpetrators were African Americans. However, there was a considerable number of white women who were also victimized. So although most of the situations occurred in predominantly Black communities, and again, most of the victims were African American, there were a considerable number of cases that involved white women, and the perpetrator was an African American male. And so what the stand your ground law did in New Orleans, it allowed people to, if they just felt threatened, if for example, if two people were walking toward their car and their vehicles was parked right near each other, and if one person felt that the other person was going to harm them, they could legally shoot and kill them, even though there was no evidence to support the belief that they were going to be harmed. So
even if my fear was irrational, so if I had an irrational fear, I didn't have to provide any kind of evidence of that irrational fear to be able to act on that.
You didn't have to. All you had to do was demonstrate, and it's really your word against whomever, that you were in fear. Now think about that, and that was that law was passed in 1997. Now fast forward, when you think about, say, policing situations, and the number one excuse for shooting unarmed Black men have been they felt their life was in threat. Almost every case. Then you think about even your stand your ground laws in places like Florida, where that Castle doctrine, they felt that their life was threatened, even if in those cases it may have been by may have been by a spouse or someone close to them. But in almost every situation, it allowed for the idea that if you were threatened or felt threatened, that you could use lethal force. So that is the origin of stand your ground laws. It's based on the ideal that a person can protect him or herself based on the threat of, or based on their fear of a threat. So, you know, we should definitely be concerned about these laws, because the disproportionate victimization, but especially on Black men, is on Black people, but especially Black men. Why? Because again, in the cases of people being afraid, this whole threat syndrome, the victim or the person who ended up getting shot is usually African-American male. Now, it's Black people in general, but we know most of the cases that have gotten attention have been where Black men have been victimized. And that is really the foundation of stand your ground laws. It's really based on giving people a pass, a legal pass to shoot and kill. That is the basis for that law. Now
I've got a follow-up question for you too, because I think when we talk about urban communities being the epicenter of crime and violence, whatever happened to the neighborhood policing initiatives that were supposed to be in place?
Okay, so first, what exactly do you mean by neighborhood policing?
In my community, we were told that the policemen on the bicycles were our friends and that they were going to be a part of the neighborhood policing, because we knew that we didn't have residency laws anymore. I think once they did away with the residency laws, we were told, oh, well, they'll still be in your neighborhood. But there's kind of a mix, I guess, in that question. Residency was no longer required in most municipalities, so they replaced it with, we're going to have neighborhood policing, and I don't know that I see neighborhood policing.
So when you said riding on the bicycle, how long ago was that?
You still see them occasionally, but not as much.
Oh, okay.
They purchase bicycles.
I would say that the police officer riding on the bicycle is part of a new initiative that involves community policing. But think about this, and you and I are old enough to know that when in the history of policing, particularly in urban communities, the neighborhood policing for most of us is what we call maintenance control, where there was 2 police officers in a car. That's what most of us remember. Now, you remember the policing with the driving on a bicycle. Now that's more new than old. That's more new than old. So what we remember when we were younger was this whole idea of 2 police officers being in the car. I don't know if you can remember back, we had 2 police officers, they were riding around. But what happened, now prior to that, the 2 police officers, prior to 2 police officers being in the car is when they were walking. You know, they had police, and this one, now I'm going all the way back to the turn of the century, going all the way back to the early 1900s, really, because that's when African Americans migrated from the south to the north. When African Americans migrated from the south to the north to come to the north primarily for work in manufacturing, car industries, and so on and so forth, that's when we changed our policing model from the police walking around the neighborhood, knowing people, to police officers being in cars. So that's when we had that maintenance order model, where there were 2 police officers. Then after that, we went from 2 being in a car to 1 being in a car. And when the 1 police officer, which is where we, for the most part, are now, but when we went to the 1 police officer being in the car, it really separated policing from the community even more, right? Thus having no relationship to the community at all. So at the heart of this question is when, it's unfortunate, but the truth of the matter is in America, whenever there is a shift in policy, it's usually associated with race. So when Black people began to migrate to the North, policing changed. That was also around the time when we began to pay attention to the level of police misconduct, particularly how police would physically beat Black people. And there was no repercussions whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So the neighborhood policing model and police misconduct in the African-American community sort of coincided. So, we went to this model of policing with one car, and again, separated police officers from the community almost entirely. And it just severed the relationship. So at this point, there was no relationship. So I fast forward to answer your question more directly. In 1994, Congress passed this piece of legislation called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, better known as the 1994 Crime Bill, which is a piece of legislation that people talk about today. This is the legislation that introduced 3 strikes you're out. It made it possible for if a person was caught with drugs, the powder versus crack cocaine, when you get more time for crack. So it decimated the Black community. The 1994 Crime Bill decimated the Black community to the extent where it destroyed lives, it destroyed families, and it really has a deleterious effect on Black communities across America to this very day. It was the most devastating piece of social legislation in the history of this country, outside of slavery and things like that. But in modern times, and I will say, just say from the 1960s all the way till today, the 1994 Crime Bill is the single most crippling piece of legislation to the Black community ever.
Wow.
And it's not even close, to be quite honest. I mean, it's really a sad commentary. But nonetheless, in that bill, it set aside funding to establish community policing, right? So it was supposed to establish a community policing model for the specific purpose of establishing a relationship between police officers and urban communities, Black people. So that money was set aside. And in that bill, there was money to support 100,000 additional police officers.
Wow.
So it was supposed to help the community. What those 100,000 police officers did was bring really more negative interaction, and it created what was already bad. It made it even worse because the legislators couldn't control how that money was being used. They put the police officers in the community, but the local communities really controlled what the police officers did. That's why it was different all around the country. So, neighborhood policing has taken on a life of its own. And really, I would say that we have never really had what I would call neighborhood policing, not nationally. There have been communities that have created their own policing models that have been effective in some cases. I know Boston has a policing model that seems to be working, but collectively, there has not been a policing model that worked. And when I say work, that brings the African-American community together to join with police officers to create a working relationship to where we can literally say we have a good relationship with police officers. That has never happened in this country.
So this whole belief that they were hired to protect, defend, and serve, is that just a misnomer?
Well, the protect, I don't know about the defend part, but we know the protect and serve is supposed to, that's that, we most often hear about this protect and serve. But I think, and this question sort of piggyback off the previous question, in the context that, African Americans have never benefited from policing, never, from its inception. So when we talk about protect and serve, the question is, for who? Because it's not been for African Americans. From its inception, policing was designed to control and instill fear in African Americans. It was the policing was policing was part of the slave patrol system. So, it was never designed for Black people to be protected. So the concept of protect and serve in the Black community was a misnomer from the very beginning. I know we hear about protect and serve, but it's really never worked out that way for Black people. Even when there was this infusion of Black police officers, because Black police officers initially was used as they were used as spies in the Black community. So that's why even right now there isn't much trust among Black people and Black police officers. Now, the one thing that so there's really no different, and the data will bear it out that Black police officers treat Black people just as bad as white police officers. They engage in police misconduct at a comparable rate. The only thing that there is a difference, and this is a more recent phenomenon, Black police officers don't shoot and kill unarmed people. So that's the difference, but that's the only difference. And so, so we know that the ideal of patrolling in Black communities, there is a legacy of police misconduct and us against them, and that it has been that way from the beginning, from when African Americans migrated from the South to the North. Black people have never enjoyed the benefits of policing. So, that's just the way it's been. And, I know a lot of time when people discuss policing in urban communities, they think about policing in the context of people of color, like we all have the same experience. And I will say, and I will challenge anybody to think differently. It's not Black and brown. The Black experience is an experience unto itself. We don't share our experiences with other people, not even Hispanic people. The experience,
so
huh?
That is so true.
Yeah, I mean, but you often hear this whole thing about Black and brown. And interestingly enough, the people that you hear it from are usually Black people. Now, think about the last time you heard an Hispanic person make reference to Black and brown. Now, I'm not saying it never ever happens, but it's rare. Most of the people who purport this shared experience is usually Black people. Now, there are different theories as to why that happened. One is that we're trying to create this coalition, political coalition, to suggest that if we were in alliance, that it will give us more political clout, and certainly it would. But because we have such a different experience, Hispanic, and this is my theory, Hispanics are not going along with that because they don't see themselves in the same way that we see ourselves. They don't see their experience as being comparable to ours. They don't have the kind of disproportionality that we do. You know, for example, when you look at the police shooting unarmed men, we represent something like 30+% of police shootings. We have a much greater representation among unarmed, but just police shootings. Well, and that's 30-something%, I think it's 33%, something like that, which is more than double of what we are in the general population. But the majority of that 33% are Black men, which is only represented by 6% of the general population. So even among, Black men are disproportionately represented even among Black people. So, you know, that's just something that people should think about. You know, the Black experience is an experience unto itself. It's not shared with any other group.
Well, I want to ask you a question about handguns, because I think I was watching a CBS report and then followed up and read an article by Kate Gibson. And she was saying that in the US, gun sales have just surged, that we've had the highest number of gun sales in 2020. And she said it was something like 17 million additional guns. Why should we be concerned about this in the Black community?
Well, I think we should be concerned because the more guns available, the more people are going to die unnecessarily. And more importantly, a disproportionate number will be young and poor, right? So, you know, if you have guns floating around in urban communities in particular, because of the poverty and the level of dysfunction and mental issues. I mean, you have people, and when I say mental issues, I'm not talking about schizophrenia. I'm just talking about people who are so upset with their current life situation that they're angry, and they often medicate themselves with drugs and alcohol. And with that, you know, you have the anger and